Chapter 1. The Debt That Bound Her. On the planet of Zalix, nestled among the endless stretches of the Andromeda Cluster, life was defined by its ancient customs and unspoken rules, none more unyielding than the custom of debt repayment. Zalix was a world both beautiful and brutal, where towering cities of shining metal and gleaming glass stood as symbols of prosperity and progress, while the dark alleys and backstreets housed the most desperate and destitute individuals, bound by chains they could never see, chains created by their families' mistakes. This was a planet where everything could be gained or lost in the blink of an eye, and it was the ancestral debts that often determined the fate of every person born there. For many, the debts of their forefathers were inherited like a heavy cloak, a burden that defined their futures before they even had a chance to decide their own paths. Lyra Valos, a young woman barely past her 20th year, had never thought much about her family's fortune until it became a prison. Growing up in the beautiful Valos estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by fields of glowing blue flora and sleek silver pathways that crisscrossed the estate's expansive grounds, Lyra had lived a life of comfort and luxury. Her parents, once the proud owners of one of Zalix's most prosperous trade networks, were revered for their business acumen and their ability to secure lucrative deals across the galaxy. But in the last few months, everything had changed. The family's wealth, their reputation, their entire life, all of it was built on the fragile foundation of debts. And when one of the largest trade agreements in the system collapsed due to unforeseen complications, everything began to unravel. Lyra had been forced to watch from the sidelines as her parents' empire crumbled. First, it was the small creditors, merchants who had loaned large sums for shipping contracts, who came knocking at the estate's doors, demanding their due. Then came the larger institutions, the banks that had once trusted the Valos name to secure long-term financial stability, and they, too, came calling. But the most devastating blow had been the trade partnership with the infamous Dowrin Consortium, a powerful organization that operated across countless systems and had a reputation for crushing anyone who failed to meet their obligations. When her father's business partner was found to have embezzled funds and mismanaged critical deals, the Dowrin Consortium had come to collect what was owed. It didn't take long for her family to fall into utter financial ruin, and as the debt mounted higher and higher, they were left with only one option, an option that had been a last resort for centuries on Zalix. The Valos family's only remaining recourse was a tradition that had been passed down through the ages, the tradition of marriage as a form of repayment. Lyra had been raised with the knowledge of the tradition, but like most young people on Zalix, she had never expected to become a part of it. The idea that her family might one day sell her, that she might be married off to repay their debts, had been nothing more than an abstract, far-off possibility, something reserved for other families, not hers. But the day came when the reality hit her full force. The Dowrin Consortium, after many meetings and discussions with her parents, had decided that Lyra would be the one to settle the family's massive debts. It was a time-honored tradition. Lyra had spent days locked away in her room, unable to escape the suffocating weight of her family's dishonor. Her mother, once a regal and dignified woman who had taken great pride in her position within the social circles of Zalix, was now reduced to a shadow of herself, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Her father, a man who had always been quick with a smile and a laugh, was now quiet, subdued, as if the life had been drained from him. And though they tried to shield Lyra from the worst of it, there was no escaping the truth. She was to be married off to someone she had never met, a stranger chosen by the consortium, a stranger whose wealth and power would repay the debts of her family and restore their name. It wasn't just the thought of the marriage that devastated Lyra, it was the coldness of the reality. She had been reduced to a mere pawn in a game she didn't understand. Her future, her desires, her freedom, all of it was irrelevant now. Her life had been predetermined by the debts of her ancestors. The wedding, which had once been a joyous occasion for those lucky enough to have it, was now a symbol of her family's failure. She was no longer a daughter, no longer an individual. She was an asset, a commodity to be traded. The thought of it consumed her, and for days she had cried, unable to stop the tears that blurred her vision and left her exhausted and hollow inside. On the day of the wedding, Lyra stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her in the ornate silver frame. She wore a delicate gown of shimmering blue silk, the color of the planet's oceans, and her hair was intricately braided, decorated with small jewels that caught the light. She looked beautiful, beautiful enough to be a princess, beautiful enough to be sold. The irony of it wasn't lost on her, but she had no choice. She was a mere vessel now, a means to an end. Her parents had been forced into silence, and though they stood behind her now, her mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and her father's face was pale with shame. She closed her eyes as the door to her chambers opened, and the sound of footsteps echoed across the floor. Her father, in his ceremonial robes, stood in the doorway, his face somber. He didn't speak at first. He just watched her with eyes that seemed to be filled with both regret and resignation. "It's time," he said quietly, his voice tight. Lyra nodded, the tears that had threatened to return held back for the moment. She had cried so much in the last few days that she didn't have the strength to cry anymore. As she walked down the hall toward the ceremonial hall, her footsteps echoed louder and louder in her ears, the weight of her fate growing heavier with each step. The walls of the grand mansion, once filled with laughter and joy, now felt like a prison. The ornate decorations seemed cold and distant, and the once welcoming air of the house had become oppressive. The world beyond those walls was no longer hers. It never would be again. When she entered the ceremonial hall, she saw him for the first time. He stood tall and commanding, dressed in the finest formal attire, his dark eyes scanning her with an unreadable expression. He was handsome, undeniably so, his chiseled features, his strong build, his confident posture. But despite his physical appeal, Lyra felt nothing. She couldn't bring herself to care about his appearance, because to her, he was just another man who was here to take her life and make it his own. The silence in the room was suffocating. Lyra's heart beat faster as she stood before him, unsure of what to expect, unsure of what to do. Her world was spinning, and yet, she had no control over it. And then, something happened that she didn't expect, something that changed everything. The man's eyes softened as he looked at her, his gaze shifting from cold calculation to something else, something more human. For the briefest moment, his eyes met hers, and in that instant, Lyra saw something different. It was as though the harshness of the world around her had suddenly faded, and there was a glimmer of hope in the man's expression. His lips parted, and he spoke in a voice so soft and warm that it nearly made her gasp. "You don't have to cry anymore," he said gently, his words laced with an unexpected tenderness. "I'm here now." Lyra's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in days, her tears stopped flowing. She didn't know why, but the strange man in front of her had somehow managed to calm the storm inside her. She blinked in surprise as his hand gently reached out, offering her comfort in a way she had never expected. And for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt something shift in her, a small spark of hope. Lyra's heart thundered in her chest, as her father's footsteps echoed behind her, growing softer as they moved further down the corridor. Her palms were clammy, her stomach twisted in a knot of anticipation and fear. Every step she took felt heavier, like an anchor pulling her deeper into a sea of uncertainty. The moment had arrived, the moment that had been looming over her for weeks, dragging her toward this unknown, this fate that felt like a shackle. The halls of the estate, once a place of laughter and warmth, now felt like a gilded cage. Everything around her, every ornate piece of furniture, every intricately woven tapestry reminded her of the life she was leaving behind. The weight of her mother's sorrowful eyes, the silence that enveloped the house, pressed down on her. But it wasn't just the house that was changing. It was her future that no longer belonged to her, but to the highest bidder. Lyra could hear the faint murmurs of guests in the ceremonial hall, their voices hushed, as if they were whispering about her, not to her. She had never been one for crowds, never one for the spotlight. But today, she was the center of attention, the bride-to-be, the sacrifice that would redeem her family. There was no escape. The Dowrin Consortium's offer had been too great to refuse. It was the only option her parents had left, and the moment had come when Lyra would fulfill her duty. When they reached the grand hall, Lyra took a deep breath, steadying herself, but the weight of her emotions seemed to shift with every breath. The door opened, revealing the long stretch of marble floors, gleaming beneath the warm, golden light of the chandeliers. Her mother, standing beside her father, glanced at her with a mixture of sadness and hope, and Lyra couldn't help but feel the suffocating pressure of her parents' expectations. At the far end of the room stood the man who was about to become her husband, a stranger whose face she had seen only in passing reports, his name spoken only in hushed tones in her presence. His stature was commanding, his presence undeniable. Tall and strong, he was dressed in the finest silks, his dark hair falling just to his collar. His expression was stoic, yet there was something about him that made Lyra's heart race in intensity in his gaze, like he was observing her every move. But it wasn't the stranger himself that made Lyra's stomach turn. It was the cold reality of her situation, the understanding that her parents had bargained away her future for the sake of survival, that this man would be the one to decide what happened to her. He was her future now, and the thought of it made her feel like she was suffocating under the weight of her family's shame. As the guests filed in, all their eyes turned to Lyra. She couldn't look at them. She couldn't bear to see their faces, their whispered comments, their judgment. All she wanted was to disappear into the walls, to melt away like vapor. But no matter how much she wanted to escape, she knew that it was too late. There was no running, no hiding from this. She was trapped. Her feet carried her forward, as if guided by some unseen force. Every step felt like it took her further away from herself, from her childhood, from everything she had known. When she reached the altar, the man stood before her. His gaze softened for the first time, a flicker of something that was almost pity? No, it was something else entirely. Something that Lyra couldn't quite grasp. The ceremony began, a blur of ancient rituals, words that felt foreign, but were part of the sacred vows binding her future. She stood still, hands trembling at her sides, eyes trained on the floor. But when the man finally spoke, his voice broke through the fog of her thoughts, clear and steady, and the words that left his lips were unexpected. "I do not want this," he said softly, his tone low but resonating with an intensity that sent a chill down Lyra's spine. "This marriage, this contract, it is not something I sought. I did not choose this, but it is a debt I must settle." Lyra's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time since the ceremony began, she dared to look up at him. There was something in his eyes, something that resembled regret, and perhaps a touch of empathy. But just as quickly as the emotion appeared, it vanished, replaced by the cold mask of a man who had come to fulfill a duty, not to find love. The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity before Lyra spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Neither did I." The room fell silent. The guests, previously murmuring and shifting in their seats, seemed to still, as if they were waiting for a moment that would define the future. And for a moment, Lyra felt the weight of it all. She was not just a daughter of the Valos family. She was now a pawn in a game of survival. But there was something in the way the man stood before her, his eyes locked onto hers, that made her wonder if he too was a prisoner of this situation. "I did not choose this," he said again, his voice gentler this time. "But I will honor my word. I will treat you with respect." Lyra blinked in confusion, unsure of whether she believed him. But before she could say anything further, the ritual was completed. The contract was signed. The vows were exchanged. She was bound to this man, this stranger who was now her husband, not by choice, but by necessity. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Groom. The days that followed the ceremony were a blur for Lyra. Her new life had begun, but nothing about it felt real. She moved through the motions like a ghost, barely able to recognize herself. The grand halls of her family estate, once a place of laughter and comfort, now felt like a mausoleum, filled with echoes of a life she could never return to. Her parents had left to take care of the aftermath of their financial collapse, and Lyra was alone with her new husband, a man whose name she didn't know, whose life she had only glimpsed through fleeting, distant glances. His name was Torin, she learned. Torin Caldrith. He was from a family known for their vast wealth and political power, a family with their own intricate ties to the Dalrin Consortium. His face was familiar to her from the countless reports, the images broadcast across Salix. But his presence was an enigma. For the first few days, Torin didn't speak much. He kept his distance, busying himself with the details of his new life, new finances, new responsibilities, new political alliances that needed to be forged. Lyra was left to navigate her new reality in silence. There were no grand displays of affection, no romantic gestures to reassure her that there was more to their union than just repayment. It was business, cold, sterile, and functional. And for the most part, that was what Lyra expected. But then, one evening, as the two of them sat in the dining room, her husband quietly eating his meal, his gaze focused on a datapad, hers drifting aimlessly to the sparkling lights outside the window, something unexpected happened. Torin looked up at her. His eyes were soft, almost contemplative. "Lyra," he said quietly, and for the first time, she could hear something different in his voice, something almost vulnerable. "I know you didn't choose this, and I know it's not what you wanted, but I will not treat you like a prisoner." Lyra's heart skipped. She had not expected those words, not from him. She had expected indifference, perhaps even cruelty, as she had heard from other women in her situation. But what Torin had said, it was different. "I'm sorry," he continued, setting down his datapad and meeting her eyes. "This is not what either of us imagined. But perhaps we can make something of it. Maybe not love, but at least understanding." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Could they truly build something from the ashes of this forced union? Was it even possible? For the first time, Lyra felt the flicker of something else, hope, however small it may have been. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she realized something. This man, the man who had seemed like nothing more than a stranger, might just be the one who could help her rediscover herself in a life that had been stolen from her. Maybe, just maybe, the tears that had flowed freely before could finally begin to dry. The days after Torin's unexpected words passed in a strange haze for Lyra. She was still adjusting to the reality of her marriage, her position, and the undeniable weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. At first, the distance between her and Torin felt like a chasm, vast and unbridgeable. He went about his duties, attending to the details of his inherited life, while she moved through the mansion like a shadow, confined to rooms that once felt like home, but now seemed foreign and cold. She wasn't sure what she had expected from him after all. Their union wasn't based on love or desire. It was a contractual arrangement, a debt repayment, nothing more. Yet, as days passed, she began to notice the subtle changes in their interactions. It wasn't immediate, nor was it overt. Torin didn't shower her with affection or gestures of kindness. He didn't offer her grand displays of passion or emotion. But there was a quiet change, a shift in his demeanor that Lyra couldn't ignore. At first, it was small things. He would occasionally ask how she was doing, not out of obligation, but with genuine curiosity. He would stop working long enough to share a meal with her, his eyes meeting hers with a soft intensity that spoke volumes. When they spoke, his voice lacked the cold detachment it had carried during their first meeting. Instead, there was a thread of warmth, a flicker of sincerity beneath his words. At night, when they retired to their shared quarters rooms that had once been her sanctuary, now transformed into a place of uncomfortable intimacy, she would lie awake, watching the ceiling as the distant hum of the mansion's machinery filled the silence. Torin slept beside her, but there was an unspoken barrier between them, something invisible yet palpable. They were strangers in a marriage that had been imposed on them by forces outside their control. She couldn't quite figure him out. He had been forced into this just as much as she had, but unlike her, he seemed to be trying, in his own way, to make the situation more bearable. One evening, after another quiet dinner, Lyra found herself standing at the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. The city below sparkled with lights, a glittering sea of lights stretching as far as the eye could see. She felt a pang of longing for a time before all of this, when her future had been her own. Her heart ached for the freedom she had lost, for the life she could never return to. Torin entered the room silently, his presence almost unnoticeable, and she didn't hear him approach until his voice broke the silence. "Are you all right?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant. Lyra turned to face him, caught off guard by the question. She hadn't expected him to care. The silence between them stretched for a moment before she responded, her voice quieter than she intended. "I don't know," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know how to be in this life anymore. It feels like everything has been taken from me. My future, my choices, my family's honor. It's all gone." Torin stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Lyra saw something deeper than the cold resolve she had come to expect from him. There was empathy in his gaze, a quiet understanding that made her pause. It was strange. She hadn't expected to find any sort of compassion in this man. He was the one who had married her to settle a debt not out of love, not out of duty. It had been a financial transaction. But now, in the flickering light of the room, she saw the weight of responsibility in his expression, the knowledge that his life, too, had been altered irrevocably by this union. I know what it's like to have everything changed, to lose control of your own life, Torin said quietly. But I won't pretend to understand the depth of your pain. I can't undo the past, Lyra. I can't make it go away. But I can promise you this. You're not alone in this. We're in this together, whether we like it or not. Lyra looked up at him, the words sinking in, though her heart was still heavy with doubt. Together, she thought, the words swirling in her mind. What did that even mean in a marriage like theirs? Could they truly be partners in anything? Or was this simply a partnership of necessity, one born from obligation rather than choice? Before she could speak, Torin continued, his tone more confident, as though he had made a decision. I know it's not much right now, he said, but we can find a way forward. It doesn't have to be just about repaying debts. Maybe we can find a way to make this work. Maybe we can find something real in all of this. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had been so consumed by her own grief, her own helplessness, that she hadn't allowed herself to consider what could be. She had been locked in her own sorrow, believing that there was no escape, no future. But now, standing before Torin, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected, hope. Small, fragile, but there nonetheless. I don't know if I can trust this, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can trust you. Torin's eyes softened, and his expression became more serious. Trust doesn't come easily, not when everything has been taken from you. But if you'll give me a chance, I'll show you that I'm not the monster you think I am. The room was silent again, the air heavy with unspoken words. Lyra didn't know what to say, didn't know if she could let go of the hurt that had consumed her for so long. But she didn't pull away when he stepped closer, didn't shrink from the warmth that seemed to radiate from him. For the first time in a long while, she felt the tiniest glimmer of something that resembled peace. I'll try, she said softly, her voice a whisper. I'll try. Chapter 3, The Unlikely Alliance. The days following that conversation were marked by subtle shifts in the atmosphere between Lyra and Torin. It wasn't a grand transformation. There were no sudden outbursts of passion or deep conversations that lasted late into the night. Instead, it was a gradual, almost imperceptible change. There were small moments that seemed to bridge the gap between them. A shared laugh over an awkward moment at dinner. A casual conversation about nothing in particular as they walked the estate grounds. These simple moments, once so rare, began to add up. The silence that had once hung heavily between them was no longer suffocating. There were still walls between them, of course, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Lyra found herself thinking about their relationship in a different light. She had been so caught up in the bitterness of her forced marriage that she hadn't stopped to consider what it could be, what it might become. It was still early, too early to know for sure, but she found herself relaxing in his presence. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was a man who, like her, had been swept into a world of obligations and responsibility. And as they spent more time together, she realized that there was more to him than the cold, calculated exterior she had first encountered. He was driven by duty, yes, but there was more to him. Compassion, a sense of responsibility not just for his own fate, but for hers as well. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the lush gardens of their estate, Torin turned to her, his gaze steady. I'm going to see the Dalrin Consortium tomorrow, he said. I need to speak to them directly. I need to make sure we can renegotiate our terms. The debt, it's not all we're worth. And I won't allow it to define our future. Lyra looked at him, surprised. You're going to stand up to them? He nodded. I've spent too long hiding behind their demands, their terms. It's time to take control. And I'm not doing this just for me, Lyra. I'm doing it for us. The sincerity in his voice made her pause. For the first time, she saw the man not as the one who had married her out of duty, but as someone willing to fight for something more for both of them. Us, she whispered, the word tasting strange in her mouth. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt possible. I won't let them win, Torin said firmly, his eyes locked on hers. And I won't let our marriage be defined by this debt. We will find a way to be free. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know if Torin could succeed. But for the first time since their marriage had begun, She allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't built on obligation alone. The days that followed Torin's promise to confront the Dalrin Consortium were filled with a quiet tension that hovered between Lyra and him. He had said he would change things, and for the first time, Lyra found herself genuinely believing him. She hadn't expected the hardness that once defined him to crack so easily. He was determined now, a man on a mission, and there was something undeniably magnetic about his conviction. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment all his life. The moment where he would finally reclaim control over his own destiny, no longer a pawn to the consortium, but the one who would dictate the terms. Lyra found herself standing by his side more often than not, offering her quiet support in ways she never thought she would. They started working together, discussing how best to approach the situation with the consortium, weighing their options, considering the consequences of every move they made. Lyra's mind, sharp and analytical, had once been solely focused on the financial collapse of her family, the overwhelming debt, and her inevitable marriage. Now, it was expanding thinking beyond survival and towards something greater: freedom, autonomy, and perhaps even a future where she wasn't just another pawn in the game of wealth and power. In the evenings, they would sit together, each in silence at first, the weight of the day's work settling in. But gradually, the silence became more comfortable. Lyra would listen as Torin spoke of his past, his family's history, the crushing weight of his inherited obligations. He would sometimes glance at her, as though searching for something in her eyes: understanding, perhaps, or a shared recognition of their circumstances. And in those quiet moments, Lyra found herself warming to him. He wasn't just the man who had taken her hand in marriage to settle a debt. He was a man, just like her, struggling to make sense of a world that had been shaped by forces beyond his control. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the vast expanse of the estate, the soft glow of the twin moons casting a silvery light over the landscape, Lyra turned to Torin, her voice more confident than it had been in days. "You really think you can do it? Convince them to rewrite the terms of the debt?" she asked, her gaze steady. Torin turned to her, his expression unwavering. "I have to. There's no other way. I've been subjugated to their will for far too long, Lyra. But we have power. Together, we have the power to change things. The Dalrin Consortium thinks they can control us, but they've underestimated us. They think that because we're tied to them through this marriage, they have a hold on us. But the truth is, we have something they don't: freedom. And freedom is more powerful than any debt." Lyra swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. Freedom. It was a word she had long since abandoned as a child of privilege, someone who had never once worried about the chains of debt that tied others down. But now, standing next to Torin, she saw that freedom was within reach. And for the first time, the idea of taking that freedom for herself didn't feel like a distant dream, it felt real. "I'm with you," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever happens next, I'm with you." Torin's eyes softened, and for the first time, his usual resolve seemed to soften too. "Thank you, Lyra. I won't let you down." Chapter 4. Reclaiming the Future. The day came when Torin was to meet with the Dalrin Consortium. Lyra had spent the night before awake, her mind racing with what was about to unfold. She could hear the distant hum of the mansion's engines as she paced through the halls, the walls closing in on her with each step. The moment of truth was finally upon them. There was no turning back now. She found Torin standing in his office, looking at a series of datapads, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he noticed her, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with that same steady resolve. "I'm ready," he said simply, though the weight of his words hung in the air. Lyra nodded, her own nervousness momentarily forgotten in the gravity of the situation. This was his moment, their moment. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The two of them left the estate and boarded Torin's private transport ship. The journey to the Dalrin headquarters took hours, and during that time, Lyra sat in silence beside Torin, each lost in their own thoughts. As they neared the towering structure of the Dalrin Consortium's headquarters, an imposing fortress of steel and glass, Lyra felt a tightness in her chest. The building loomed before them, its sharp, angular edges piercing the sky like a testament to the consortium's power. She had been here before, had seen this structure from a distance, but this time, it was different. She wasn't just an outsider looking in. She was inside, ready to face the very force that had taken control of her life. The doors of the transport slid open, and they were greeted by the consortium's representatives, businesslike men and women in tailored suits, their faces cold and unreadable. Torin stepped forward with confidence, his posture straight, his eyes hard as steel. Lyra followed, her heart pounding, but there was no fear in her step. For the first time since this whole nightmare had begun, she felt a sense of control. The meeting was tense. The representatives of the Dalrin Consortium sat behind a sleek, metallic table, their eyes flicking to Lyra and Torin as they entered. They spoke in cold, calculated terms, listing off the debts that had been incurred, outlining the terms of repayment. Lyra felt as if she were on trial, every word directed at her, as though she were the cause of her family's downfall. But Torin stood tall beside her, his presence unwavering. "I'm here to propose something different," Torin said, his voice steady, his tone commanding. "The debts that have been accrued are indeed substantial, but they are not insurmountable. I am prepared to offer you an alternative, an agreement that allows us to settle these debts in a way that benefits both sides and frees my wife, Lyra, from the chains of this arrangement." The room fell silent as the representatives exchanged looks. Lyra's heart raced as she listened to the murmur of voices. She didn't know what Torin had in mind, but she trusted him. His determination, his belief that they could reclaim their future, it resonated in her own heart. She had never believed in the power of one person to change the course of their lives. But now, as Torin stood before the consortium, she felt the tides shifting. Finally, one of the consortium's leaders, a tall woman with sharp features and calculating eyes, spoke. "You think you can change the terms of this agreement? You think you can simply walk away from your obligations?" Torin met her gaze without flinching. "I think you've underestimated the value of what we offer. We are not pawns in your game. We are the future, and the future is not something you control." Lyra stood beside him, her hand subtly brushing against his, an unspoken show of support. The weight of her decision, the weight of her life, was no longer just his burden. It was theirs, together. The room grew quiet again as the representatives deliberated. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. Then, finally, the woman who had spoken earlier stood up. Her eyes remained fixed on Torin, her expression unreadable. "We are willing to discuss new terms," she said, her voice cool, but not as cold as before. "But understand this will not be easy. You're asking for much." "I'm asking for what's rightfully ours," Torin replied, his voice unwavering. "And I'll settle for nothing less." The deal was struck. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. The Dalrin Consortium had agreed to renegotiate the terms, allowing the Valos family's debts to be settled in a way that wouldn't require Lyra's life to be forfeited. There would still be hard work ahead, but the weight of the debt no longer rested solely on her shoulders. As they left the building, Lyra breathed a sigh of relief. She had not only regained a sense of agency, but she had also begun to see the future not as a chain binding her to the past, but as a path that stretched out before her, a path she could walk, and walk beside Torin. Torin glanced at her, his expression softer than it had been before. "We did it," he said, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Lyra nodded, her heart light. For the first time in a long while, she felt something like hope, a future that was no longer defined by the debts of her ancestors, but by the choices she and Torin would make together. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could grow from even the most unlikely of beginnings.